This is Creative Banter, a creativity and philosophy-focused podcast hosted by Cody Schultz and Ben Horn. In this episode, we continue our discussion from last week around large format film photography and how to get started. Primarily, we speak on the topic of scanning your film, whether it's through drum scanner, flatbed scanner, or digital camera. We then move on to questions sent in by you, the listener, over on our Discord server. These include talking about how Ben and I organize our film, both the physical and scanned versions, as well as whether we would still pursue photography if film no longer existed. We end this week's discussion by answering whether the voice in our head, which asks why we are doing this, ever goes away. Let's dive right into it, shall we? So we had a more direct question on film types. If someone was asking if we could explain the difference between the negative films, transparency films, and positive films. So negative films are pretty much the easiest to explain, I think.
Yeah.
They are the inverted colors, essentially. So if you take a digital photograph, turn it to black and white, and then you invert that, that's what the film looks like after it's been developed. I don't know if you can do that as well with color negative.
No, color negative is a bit different in the process because it has like this color mask to it. But I think one of the important things to know is that with a negative film, whether it's a black and white or whether it's a color negative film, those films and the way that they work, they have an amazing ability to hold on to so much detail in the bright and the dark areas. So they have an enormous dynamic range, which, if you have a black and white film and you just print the image just as it is in the darkroom, sometimes it's just a little bit too gray and you don't really have enough contrast in it. But you have all that detail to work with. And so you can pull that tonality out with the dodging and the burning, and then you end up with this really gorgeous, contrasty image. And the same is true for color negative films. So you end up with this enormous dynamic range.
I think black and white films, you have right around like 16 stops of dynamic range, something insane like that digital has only recently begun touching on, at least from what I've seen.
And with the with the negative films, you have almost endless detail in the highlights, but it's your shadows you have to be very careful of. So if you underexpose a negative film and you lose your shadows, there's nothing there. So it's the opposite of working with a digital, whereas if you lose your highlights on digital, there's nothing there. And so much of working with a negative film is protecting the shadows, making sure you have detail in the shadows. But the highlights just kind of gracefully keep going and going and going. And that's part of the look, especially when you see people working with Kodak Portra, which is a color negative film. That's part of the aesthetic of the film, where you can overexpose a photo and the colors just kind of keep going. They get a little bit more pastel, they get softer. But it would take actually a lot of work to overexpose a color negative film to the point where it starts looking really gross and ugly. But if we contrast that to a transparency film, so I work with Provia a lot, and Provia is a color transparency film where when it's developed, you put it on the light box and it's like you're looking at reality. Everything looks as it is, but also by the very nature of working with the film, and it could be called transparency films. It can be called color positive films. There's slide film. There's a different terminology for it. But with this film, your contrast is set by the film itself, and it has a much lesser dynamic range. So it would be kind of like shooting JPEG mode on a digital camera with one of the preset settings in the camera that gives it a bit of contrast, a bit of saturation.
Kind of like what people do now with Fuji cameras.
Yes. So it's kind of like there are film simulations on there, but you get what you get. So if your image is a little bit too bright, you're not getting that detail back from the highlights. If it's a bit too dark, you're not getting the detail back from the shadows. And so you have to be very careful about the light that you work with in this film, because you can very easily blow out the highlights or block out the shadows, and it does not look good. It doesn't have a nice aesthetic to it with the blown out highlights or the blocked up shadows. So that sort of film really needs to be used in very controlled, very calm light, which for me is reflected light. You know, if there's an area with some direct sunlight, it's going to look blown out and kind of weird. So when you work with a transparency film, you have to be very good with your metering. You have to make sure that you have to thread the needle basically, because otherwise you can tell that it doesn't look good. It looks like a mistake.
That's also what makes it so intimidating to even get started with.
Yeah.
That's why I haven't really touched it much, just because I don't necessarily photograph in the light that would be conducive to that. A lot of my photographs are taken in relatively harsher light, midday light, than what transparency film would really shine through with.
Yeah, sort of like the dappled forest light would just be not conducive for transparency film. And that's why, like, if I'm photographing up in the redwoods, for example, you can take pictures with digital or with a color negative film or a black and white film with sort of the dappled light, and you can make it look very, very good, very dynamic. You try that with transparency film, it just kind of looks like a mess. Yeah. So like the foggy, subdued sort of scenes are beneficial for that. That's why also, if you look at my portfolio, since pretty much everything is photographed on transparency film, you'll see that the images have a very calm feeling to them, because they have to be photographed in calm light. And I will switch to a color negative film if it's a scene that has a very, very big range of tones between bright and dark. So if you have some deep shadows with some bright highlights, I'll use color negative film for that sort of situation. And that's probably also a scene where black and white would work well.
Now, I could be wrong on this. Maybe one or two are out there, but there's no true black and white positive film out there. There are processes that you can do if you're developing at home to turn a black and white negative into a positive. I have not personally experimented with these, but there are videos on YouTube that go over it. I'll find and link one down below that kind of shows off that process. I don't necessarily know how to feel about it, but it's there. So, yeah, there's that. I just wanted to get that out there because it's something that, so there's color transparency, but is there black and white transparency? And not really.
And I would suspect that by the very nature of having a black and white transparency film, I would imagine that you're going to end up with a contrast that's going to be very strong, which might be a little too much. And also not really having control over the specific tones of it. Like I think we all love a rich, contrasty black and white print from the darkroom. I mean, think of some of like Ansel Adams' work or Clyde Butcher's work. But that is something that is created with a lot of care, a lot of attention, a lot of specific control in order to reach that level of contrast. But if something came out of a camera with really rich, dark contrast, I think I would feel like it wouldn't be exactly how I'd want it to be, and you can't really undo it.
Right. Someone was also asking about scanning and the differences between a flatbed scan, a drum scan, if we have ever used digital cameras to scan our film, like a lot of people are starting to do more recently now. What is your process when it comes to scanning your film?
So I have a flatbed scanner at home. It's an older model now. It's the V700 from Epson, and it has the ability to go to do 35 millimeter medium format, 4x5, 8x10. So it can do all of them. The flatbed scanners do better with the larger the format. So 8x10 it scans really well. 4x5 does really well. Medium format, okay. 35 is a little disappointing.
Yeah, don't even bother.
Yeah, it just has to do with the resolution of the scanner. I actually have been very satisfied with the flatbed scans I do with the scanner. I only will do a drum scan, which I'll say kind of what that is in a moment, but I'll do a drum scan if I have someone order a print, because a drum scan will give basically the highest quality scan that you can get. And I don't own a drum scanner. Not many people do. I have some friends who have them, and they oftentimes will have drum scanning services in order to find some way of monetizing this very large, very expensive piece of equipment that they own. So a drum scanner is a different method where the sheet of film is mounted to a clear cylinder, which is, I don't know, maybe a foot and a half tall or so, but it's like this clear cylinder, maybe, I don't know, 6 inches in diameter, maybe a little bigger. So it mounts to it with fluid, and then you put a clear sheet over it. And then that is going to drop into this scanner, which is like this really tall unit. And what happens is that drum spins, that cylinder spins really fast. And then there's a light source, I think, that extends up into the drum. And then it basically scans the film. And the reason it spins is so that the centrifugal force of it makes it basically a super flat scan, so that you don't have the film can't have any sort of irregularities from it being not the same distance from the scanner. But it's like this weird techie way of scanning that gives you a beautiful scan. It takes a long time, but you get really good detail in the shadows, really good detail in the highlights, very well suited for transparency film. But it's expensive, and it takes time to do. But I'll have those scans done if someone orders a print, just so that I can know that I have the best possible scan. But also those scans are expensive. They're like a couple $100. So you're not going to just, randomly scan images with a drum scanner. If I were to compare a flatbed to a drum scan, the drum scan is going to have more nuanced color, more nuanced contrast. It sees better into the dark areas. And with the full flatness, you don't have to worry about any sort of like weirdness towards the edges of the film. Like on my flatbed, edge of the film might lift up a little bit when I have it on the scanner, and you get a little weirdness there. But those are the two main ways. Then if people are shooting especially smaller formats, 35 millimeter, medium format, you can do it with large format as well. But you had mentioned using a digital camera to scan it. This method does work quite well. I know a lot of people will have a specific setup where you have like a really high quality light box, so you have good color rendering and such. And then you have the camera looking straight down on it, perhaps with a macro lens, depending on the format. And then you can work with that scan basically the same way you would just any digital image. I've only played with that a little bit. The results are actually pretty decent. But the larger the format you go, the better off you are with a flatbed or with a drum scanner.
With digital camera scanning, it's also going to rely a lot on the resolution of your lens as well as your camera. So
yeah,
I know that Natalie Oberg, she does a lot of her scanning, even on her 8x10s, in this same method.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I remember from talking to her, she uses I think it's like 100 millimeter macro lens on a high resolution digital camera.
Mm-hmm.
And she's taking 8 to 10, if not more, photographs of sections of her film.
Oh, wow, so that takes some dedication.
Yes. So it's a very long, drawn out process. And then you have to go in and stitch all of these together. It, of course, could save you quite a bit of money and get close, perhaps, to the resolution of a drum scan.
Yeah.
But you need the time, you need the dedication, etc. Who have you used for your drum scanning?
Currently, I'm using Michael Strickland, who does
Okay.
a really, really good job. Before that, I forget his name. There was a photographer out of, it's not Alex Burke, but a photographer out of Colorado that I was using. I think it was Jim something. I forget his name. But I used him and he was also excellent. But yeah, those, if you have a good relationship with someone who has a drum scanner, it's it's a good friend to have.
Yeah, yeah. I was gonna say I've sent some of my film to Strickland before. I've sent some to Alex Burke.
Mm-hmm.
Both have been great results. No complaints from either of them. For those overseas, I believe Tim Parkin of On Landscape magazine, I believe he does drum scanning as well.
Over in the UK, yeah.
Yeah. So he's an option for over there because I don't know about you, but I personally would not want to send my film across the ocean into a new
That's a bit
country.
far.
Yeah. And there are others out there as well. There are plenty of services out there, labs that still do it here and there at least.
Yeah.
I've been quite happy with my flatbed scanner. I use a V850 from Epson, which is just the updated model of your V700.
Yeah.
I haven't had any complaints. I know that depending on how you go about the settings, and if you set it up properly, you can get quite amazing results.
Yeah.
I've actually shocked myself a couple times scanning my 4x5 where I'll crop in after I've scanned it. I'll crop into a certain area that I'm like, oh, this isn't going to be sharp. This isn't going to be detailed or worth anything. I'm like, oh, it is.
Yeah.
I could actually print this at a respectable size, even if it's cropped in at 200%. I know we mentioned about Nick Carver. He uses a flatbed scanner primarily for his, and he's primarily with medium format, and he's printed up to 40 by 50.
Yeah.
If not larger.
I'll routinely scan my film at about that size. Obviously, coming from 8 by 10, your file size is the same. You just have a little bit of a finer grain in it. But when you're scanning on like a flatbed, if you are working with color negative or if you're working with black and white, you can get basically all the detail that's in that film in terms of the bright and dark areas just fine. If you are working with a transparency film and you have some dark shadows, that's the tricky area. With a drum scan, anything you basically can see with your eye on the film in terms of areas kind of hidden deep in the shadows, the drum scanner should be able to really get most of that. But with a flatbed scan, it has a limit in terms of how deep into the shadows it can get. And so that's something to be mindful of, where if you have a particularly tricky sheet of film where there are some deeper shadows that you'd like to recover from transparency film, a drum scan will get you a better scan than a flatbed. But honestly, I very seldom run into that. I think maybe when I was first getting into it and I wasn't very good with exposure, but now I can get most all of what I need. And if I compare my flatbed scan to the drum scan, the differences are not significant as one would think. Though I will say that with a drum scan, if you had a need to produce an absolutely enormous file, a drum scan can do that. As a comparison, one of my sheets of film when Michael Strickland when he first got his drum scanner, and it's cool that happened to be one of my favorite photos I've taken. He says, I want to do a little experiment. I want to scan this in like 3 pieces. And by that, I don't mean like, cutting the film up with scissors. But basically do it in 3 runs of the scanner, because there's a maximum file size the scanner can handle and the computers and everything, and then stitch it together. And I think my result was like 700 megapixels. And it still wasn't even resolving the grain. I mean, like it could go closer if there was more detail to go. So if you do need a huge file for whatever reason, a drum scanner can get you that.
Yeah. They're definitely the way to go if you're using film and you want the absolute best of the best if you plan on printing really big. At least for me, I don't really see a need in that because I don't plan on printing much larger than, say, 20 by 25.
Yeah, so you're fine with the flatbed.
Right. Let's see. What else do we got here? So, kind of going along with our scanning process, how do you catalog your scans?
So let's start with you. How do you keep track of your film?
I keep everything I'll have a folder for the year. So I'll have 2022 folder. Within that folder, I'll have a folder for each of the months that I have film for. So if I don't photograph anything in September, I just won't have a September folder. And then within that, I'll have individual folders for each of the days that I have photographs from. And then within that, obviously, are the scans and the files themselves that are saved typically as like a TIFF file. And then I'll throw that all into Lightroom and go about my happy little editing ways.
And how do you physically store the film?
So physically, I keep everything in a little binder. It's kind of the same as with my digital files. I have a binder for each year. So I have a 2022 binder. Then I have the print sleeves for 4x5. It's 4 sheets of film per sleeve. And I'll write down the date. I'll write general area of where I was. Like if I'm up at the cabin, I'll just write Nord's Resort. And I just lay it out where you open up that binder and you have January 1st from the very first thing that you see. And then at the very end, it's December 31st. And that's just how I've been pretty happy with organizing my film. I like to keep it on a yearly basis rather than a project or area basis, just because I'm photographing so many different areas throughout the year that it doesn't really make sense, and it could get very chaotic if I tried to organize it by, say, whichever local parks I go to.
Yeah, for me, as far as the physical film part, so when I come back from a trip, I'll have, I don't know, like between 30 and 40 usually sheets of 8x10 film, and it'll come in its own little protective sleeves. I will take that film, I will put it in a box made by Printfile, the same boxes that I used to use for my box sets. And I will then have a piece of paper where I write, what trip that was for. And if I had multiple trips, let's say if I went to Death Valley and then I did another winter trip as well where I went to Zion, and those fit in one box. So then I would just say, Death Valley, Zion, winter 2022. And I don't use a binder because when it comes down to it, the binders take up a lot more space versus just putting film in the boxes and then labeling the box. But then I'll take the boxes of film that's labeled, and I'll put that inside a Pelican case, and then I'll have I just have like a sock filled with rice in there just to soak up any sort of humidity or anything in there to keep it nice and dry in there. But that's how I organize a film. If I have to go back and find a particular sheet of film, I can just find the box for the trip that it corresponds to. And I guess for me, since I do the video journals, I could pretty quickly just use the video journals as a reference to figure out what trip a particular photo was shot on. And then I can go back and find it that way. I would love to have it in binders where it's all organized and laid out, but it gets to be so bulky that way with the amount of film that I have, especially with 8x10, that just putting it in the boxes and then dropping that inside a Pelican case seems to keep things fairly compact, and it allows me to find stuff pretty easily. Once on the computer, I just have a folder on my computer for 8x10 scans. I have another folder for 8x10 drum scans, and then I have the folders just organized by trips on there. Since for me, that's a pretty good way of organizing, because I'll think of a trip and then I'll think of the photos I shot on that trip. So for me, kind of a location-based approach, and also it'll show the date at least of the start of the trip. But that's how I do it. It's not super fancy, but it keeps things pretty compact and allows me to find the film fairly easily. I don't use any databases or anything like that.
Do you have any rough estimate as to how many photographs you typically, or how many sheets of film rather, you typically expose throughout a year?
If I were just to do the rough math, I'd say probably, let's say 3 trips and 30 sheets each. So maybe like 90 or so,
Okay.
give or take. And that's maybe even a little bit less than that, because usually my spring trip, I don't shoot as much, as we talked about in one of the last episodes, spring being a not as productive trip for me. But yeah, somewhere around 70, 80, 90, somewhere like that. What about you?
I'm typically around maybe 150 to 250, something like that. I haven't really tracked back recently how many I've exposed, but that tends to be around the average. So, which makes it nice because they sell the film that I buy in boxes of, I think it's 100 sheets. So 2 boxes of those per year, and that pretty much covers more than enough for what I need.
Yeah.
Because it all depends on year over year as well, how often I get out and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So.
And one thing I do find to be interesting is I actually have 2 Pelican cases now that are filled with those boxes of film. Those things are heavy. You don't think about it when you're shooting. You don't think about the film being heavy, but once you start to amass, all these sheets of film inside those boxes, inside the Pelican case, man, it's a workout pulling those things out. So it gives you a bit more of an appreciation of like, here's a physical manifestation of all the photos I've taken on 8x10 since 2009. It is kind of satisfying, really.
We also had another question that asked, have you ever used digital medium format?
I honestly have no desire. And the main reason is anytime you're working with digital, and this is something that a little while back, I don't know, going on about 2 years ago, I bought a Sony mirrorless and a couple lenses just to see how I would react to shooting digital now that I've been working with film for so long, thinking maybe I was missing something. And there's something about, and there's nothing wrong with digital. Digital's fantastic. So I don't want it to sound like I'm trash talking digital, but there's something about working with film where you get away from the perfectionism of digital in terms of expecting a lens to be perfect, expecting, I don't know, just like new cameras come out, higher resolution, this and that. And there's this obsolescence cycle, this expecting of perfection from a piece of equipment that can never be perfect. And I feel like going to medium format takes that in a whole new direction where now the expectations are even higher because the cameras are more expensive, the lenses are more expensive, and you have a greater expectation of that degree of perfection, which the camera can never deliver. And I feel like I've never worked with it, but based on my experience working with other digital kits, I find it just leaves me unsatisfied with the work that I produce with it, which is one of the main reasons why I do enjoy working film, because it builds that greater sense of satisfaction. But I don't really have any desire to work with medium format. I think the only exception to that would be perhaps with one of the more technical cameras where you have the medium format back with kind of what looks like a little 4x5 camera you put on it. But even that, I don't know. I just don't think it's the right tool for the way that I work.
So would you still photograph if film was no longer available? I think we had talked a little bit about this in the previous episode, but it got brought back up on the Discord, and I was curious, especially because of the medium format argument.
I would, but I would feel like it's just not the same experience. And I think that's one of the things with large format. It's a process oriented technique where the process itself brings so much joy. And I feel like with digital, some of that is missing. And it's the sort of thing where people, they don't, it's a difficult thing to describe to someone who hasn't really experienced working with both of them. But there is something very different about working with film. And I people are always quick to get this whole like film versus digital thing, which I think is kind of a silly argument to have, because they're both fantastic. But most of the people who shoot film these days also can shoot digital as well. They usually have both skill sets. But there's something about film that really enhances the process of working with it, and is just very conducive for making a very pleasant experience in the field and making you work hard for things and all that sort of stuff that deals with human nature, the lack of instant gratification. I still would photograph if I wasn't shooting film, because that's just kind of in my DNA, but it wouldn't be the same.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It definitely would not be nearly the same, because you lose so much of a process. You lose that little dance that you tend to find yourself doing with large format that you cannot get with digital. You can't, because the process is so different.
Yeah.
I've never shot with digital medium format. I would like to at some point, because it's just one of those things, check it off your bucket list kind of deal. I think it would be interesting to see how it reacts in comparison to regular digital files versus large format, and if it is kind of like a more of a happy medium, so to speak, between the two. If film no longer was around and wasn't available, I don't know how quickly I would adapt to photographing digitally. So I can't say for positive whether I would still photograph. It's like you, it's in my DNA to create, but the end result of my creation does not necessarily have to be a photograph. I've often thought of taking up like digital art and trying my hand with that, and various other art forms that may end up giving different and potentially better results than what I could with a camera. It would just really depend on when or where we are in the photographic world when that would happen. So are we currently able to use tilt shift lenses more accessibly or more natively with certain medium format cameras? Then that process is getting closer. But if tomorrow all of a sudden Ilford and Kodak and Fuji all just shutter their film production completely, I can't say for sure whether I would continue photographing, which is really weird to say after how many years of using a camera to express myself.
That's interesting. I mean, obviously, also my livelihood completely depends on photography. So if there was no more film, then I would have to, I'm not gonna let my cat starve. So I mean, I would be forced to adapt. I would go kicking and screaming. But also, I know that the vast majority of people listening to this, they don't shoot film, and the fact that it must look absolutely crazy from the outside to be lugging around some ancient camera and shooting expensive film. Like, I can understand how it makes no sense whatsoever. But at the same time, the people I know who have worked with both mediums, I think that they realize that there is something very special about it. And I think that something that is special about it would be missing to go to a different sort of process and not to have, shooting film anymore. So just as you were saying, like it has a profound impact. And And I can totally understand how you would be reluctant to perhaps, still do photography if film wasn't around. I can totally understand that.
How would you say the creative process has changed with the introduction of large format? And this may be more easily attuned to me, I think, because
Yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
just because you have for so long been with large format versus digital.
Yeah.
It's certainly slowed me down tremendously. And I know that's kind of like the cliche, stereotypical answer for anyone who shoots film. It's the hipster way of saying, yeah, that's why film's so great, because it slows you down.
Yeah.
Which it does, especially with large format. You're going from being able to take thousands of photographs in an hour to taking one, if any at all. And so I've had to learn to adapt to that and really see the compositions, the world around me in a much different manner. And I think that's also why I focus so strongly on the intimate side of the woodlands. I don't really focus on the grand scenes, the amazing sunsets, or the bright, vibrant, saturated colors that a lot of other digital photographers may lean towards, because there are a lot of constraints with large format too when it comes to trying to photograph those scenes. It's very difficult to capture a scene super quick because it takes you 5, 10, 15 minutes to set everything up. Longer depending on the scene itself and metering and how experienced you are. So there's been a lot of reflection that has been needed on my end as I've transitioned to large format, and still as I continue down this path with large format. That's really looking at what I want out of photography and what I want out of the creative process, and just going all in on those specific things and forgetting the rest.
Yeah. For me, I think the limitation of large format is huge, because when you're limited in some ways, you have a tendency to become more creative.
Yeah.
And I think which ties into the whole slowing you down, because it slows you down because the process takes longer. There's some limitation involved in that. But you can very easily overcome those limitations by being a bit more creative. And also it results in a forced sense of patience. With large format, you have to be patient. There's no real way around it. And I think that is one of the things that I learned pretty early on when I switched to large format, is that, especially when working with transparency film, is that, if your exposure isn't right, there's no point. If your choice of subject isn't great, if your light isn't great. So you really have to check all those boxes to make sure that you're going to be able to produce the image that you have in mind. And you have to be patient in order to do that. And also, the other thing I learned when I switched to large format is that it allows you to focus more on the subject, allows you to focus more on the task at hand. And at least for me, my brain can't really do multiple things at once. So if I'm concentrating on doing photography, I'm not thinking about other things. Versus you can be out and take pictures with a digital camera and your mind can be in all kinds of different places. But with a large format, it forces you to be patient, it forces you to be creative, it forces you to slow down. And I think that's what comes through in the work, and I think that's what makes for such a enjoyable experience of working with it, just because it commands that level of focus and attention.
Yeah, there's really nothing like it. Not that I've experienced with photography. One final question that we have going here.
Okay.
Does the voice in your head screaming, "Why the hell am I doing this?" ever go away? Which I think is quite apt to end on.
That's a good question. I think it does, because at least my take on that question is that for me, it seems completely natural. It seems completely normal. The whole process from, hiking with an 8x10 camera and very limited film on hand, to, recognizing the potential of a subject, crafting the composition. I don't question any of it anymore. I just kind of go with it. And even like the price of film, the price of processing, all that sort of stuff that adds up, that seems very intimidating when you're first getting into it, which can lead to a person questioning why they're doing something. To me, I don't factor any of that in. It's just part of the process, to the point where if you hand me a digital camera, I'm going to be just completely intimidated by that camera. I mean, I can work it. I mean, I can work digital fine, but like it'd be like, putting me in a car without a seatbelt and telling me to drive. I'm like, something's wrong with this. This isn't quite, there's something weird with this. Having all the constraints of large format, it just feels normal after a while, to the point where that's just the way I create images. So I think that voice does go away with time. But also I've been working with 8x10 since 2009, and I think it was 2008 I started with 4x5. So I don't know when that voice went away, but I don't hear that voice anymore.
Well, at least that's reassuring that it does eventually possibly go away.
What? So I'm guessing you still have that voice of question.
It's weird. Like, there are times where, like you, I won't even look at my decision to continue with it and think twice. But there are also times where I'm like, maybe something else could be different here. Like, especially when I'm hiking up a steep incline and I have almost 30 pounds on my back, and I'm just thinking the entire time, this would be so much lighter with a mirrorless camera and a single lens.
Yeah.
So that's really the major time when I actually think, why am I doing this? To take it more realistically. But there are so many times where I look at it and, like, I use the Mamiya RB67 that I got. I'll pick that up and I'll start using that a little, and I'm like, something just feels wrong. Something's missing. Just like your car analogy, just something is off here. And then I go back and I pick up the 4x5 and I'm like, oh, yep, there it is. That's more like it. So I definitely think, like you, it's a voice that does go away. When it goes away, I have no idea. But
yeah. And the times when I have questioned whether that's the right path for me to go down, I've tried going down other paths, like the time when I bought the digital kit, or other stuff along those lines. But usually, for me at least, those paths all lead back to the original path that I was on. And so is this like a little, side trip for a little bit, but it just leads, it really only serves to reinforce that the road I was already on was the best way to be going, at least for my way of working. That leads to the highest degree of satisfaction with the work, and also to kind of a timelessness to the work, where you can take a photo and you can be proud of that image in a way that, as technology moves on, as new cameras come out, as everything along those changes, you can still be just as satisfied with that image now as you were, back when it was captured. And so I think it's that timelessness that keeps me coming back to it. The working with a mature technology, which is, I think there's a lot of joy that comes with that process, as opposed to a technology that's constantly changing. And so I think that's one of the reasons I stick with it, because it's what I found works best for me and gives me the results and gives me the sense of satisfaction that, for me at least, is long term. I hope you enjoyed our creative banter. You can learn more about Cody's work by visiting his website, codyschultz.com. and you can find my work at benhorn.com. For further discussion, join us at patreon.com/creativebanter. It's a place where we can interact with you, the listener. And although we greatly appreciate those who contribute by joining a tier, discussions are open to everyone, whether you're a paying member or not. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you around next time.